this section of Isaiah 28 through 33, we have, again, many different perspectives of what's happened in the earth in the end times. And what keeps this unit together in a literary way, just so to give you an idea, is 6 distinct woes, or 6 distinct calls for judgment from the Lord. But even though there's calls for judgment, there's also great glimpses of God's glory and the benefits for the judgments, what they produce. Now, the woes are really on northern Israel, Jerusalem, on Jewish leadership for seeking out a covenant with Egypt or seeking out a covenant with another nation in order to protect themselves from a looming threat. And the final woe is against the ancient empire of Assyria, but because the judgment is all supernatural in fire in chapter 30, chapter 33, we know it's really about a future Antichrist empire that's taking up that space from ancient Syria. It's that same part of the earth. And so again, Isaiah continues to show us, keep an eye on present-day Iraq, parts of Syria, Turkey. That ancient Assyrian empire will someday have be part of the Antichrist power base to attack Israel. And so that's what this holds. Now let's just look a little bit about Isaiah 28. We see the covenant of death. This is God rebuking the Jewish leadership from, instead of seeking Him, because they're not in relationship with Him anymore, they're going to other country or other empire, which we know is probably Egypt, in looking for a treaty to protect themselves. He calls it a covenant of death. He says, even you use this, you're going to try to be using it like a little blanket, trying to stretch it out across yourself, but it doesn't feel like it can ever keep you warm. He's like, this covenant you make, the moment you make, you already realize it's not sufficient enough. It can't cover you like I can. And so God takes offense to this covenant because not only does it open up the nation of Israel to death, but it's also in the place of trusting Him. He's jealous for their love. He's jealous for their trust. In this section also, again, we talked about the ancient Assyrian Empire being judged. In chapter 29, in chapter 30 and 33, we see the Lord call them plunderers. He's calling them treacherous. We see supernatural fire from heaven coming down on this area, and the Lord judging them severely, supernaturally. This is going to happen. Also, we see some great things. Now, even though the intense judgment's great for those that are being oppressed by wickedness, that's actually great. But we see some blessings coming on the millennial earth, especially like in chapter 32. We see a really clear place that shows righteous Israeli society. Instead of spiritual blindness, we see people being able to hear God's word. We see leaders that are put in, leaders, and every leader that is godly and looking out for the weak. We see a righteous society. And Isaiah has a lot of places where he's pointing the finger at Jewish society that is ignoring God and exploiting the poor. Here we see one in the future. After they go through judgment, they will actually be responsive, wise, righteous. And we see some other things in the millennial earth. This section actually has a lot of places where there's water in Israel. Now, that is remarkable because Israel is a part of the Middle East. It's always been hard to get water. But when the Lord comes back, there'll be both natural and supernatural sources of water in the land. We learn later in Isaiah 51, it's going to be like the Garden of Eden there. And here we see, for those even whose place is on high in Jerusalem, this high mountain, there'll be sources of water there. And in Isaiah 33:20, there'll be rivers there that even boats can travel through in the land. So this isn't like the Israel we know right now, but because of the bold judgments and the giant earthquake at the end, God's going to reconfigure the land, and there'll be actually fresh water sources coming up from the ground. That should also remind us of God lifting the curse to what it was like back in the Garden of Eden when water came up from the ground. And so because of Jesus' leadership, there'll be even greater sources of water. Besides water in a righteous Jewish society, there'll even be healing, there'll even be a restoration within the family. There's just many things. And at the end of Isaiah 33, the most important thing of all, it's the beauty of Jesus. It says in verse 17 that the Jewish nation, your eyes will see the King and His beauty. And so the nation will have a personal understanding of Jesus as the King, as a lawgiver, as a judge. And they're going to know Him personally, be impacted by His leadership. And this is the most important part of what's coming. Jesus himself ruling there and leading the nation himself as a king.